Hi everyone, it's Sade. Welcome back to our video updates. Today I was asked to talk about what are the options for people that would like to back out of contracts that they signed prior to the pandemic because they're not able to continue with performance under those contracts. That question is a loaded question, so I'll try to address it as quickly as I can. And just give you the general overview from an educational standpoint. The question is essentially asking, how can I breach a contract without breaching it? So the way that you could breach a contract without breaching it under an event such as a pandemic is typically by calling that event an act of God. And we've all heard that expression before. So in legal terms, we call that clause that allows for that kind of excuse, it's called the force majeure clause. I believe it's of French origin, French and Latin origin, and it just means superior force. So force majeure clause is typically found in commercial contracts. The contracts that are consumer contracts sometimes have them, a lot of them don't have them, but it typically just says that the party is excused from performance of the contract if an act beyond the control of that party occurs, and such an act was unforeseeable at the time of entering into that contract, and that such non-performance will not be considered a breach. And it will list examples and say such acts include but are not limited to hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, etc. So that's typically what the force majeure clause would look like. It's an excuse to non-performance to allow somebody to not perform what they agreed to, and it still is not considered a breach. So that is one way that you can go about breaching without breaching if you have the force majeure clause and you follow it to the T. So typically the clause will be in there, and then it would say that there are requirements to being able to invoke that clause. You might have to notify the other party in writing within a certain period of time. So just look inside your contract first to see if it has that language. And then if it does, then you can definitely invoke that force majeure clause. In a situation such as COVID-19, I think it would fit perfectly well under an act of God that was unforeseeable at the time of entering into the contract. Now, we also have to look at whether that act of God renders your performance impossible. So the pandemic is going on, but it doesn't necessarily stop every single contract from being able to be performed. So my contract for house cleaning, let's say I had a house cleaning business and the pandemic happens, I certainly shouldn't be cleaning houses if the government already has shelter in place laws or guidelines saying that people have to stay in their homes and not go about unnecessarily. So that might be excused based on the pandemic. However, if I have a business that's a tech business that requires me to provide technical services remotely, then I'm not going to be able to use the pandemic as an excuse not to perform, because I can essentially still do my work from anywhere. So those are some examples of how the force majeure clause might work for some people, but not for others, depending on the terms of each agreement. So it's always based on the circumstances. So what about if your contract does not even have that force majeure clause that I'm talking about, so that it doesn't even mention anything about being able to be excused for non-performance? If your contract doesn't have that, you still have a chance to be able to invoke something called impossibility under common law. It's a common law doctrine that actually is called impossibility of performance, but it has three different components that are covered under that. So there are three different types of doctrines, but they are all essentially called impossibility because there's no functional distinction between or amongst them when the court is applying the doctrines. So the first one, like I said, is impossibility of performance. The second one is commercial impracticability. And then the last one is frustration of purpose. So you can see by the way they sound, by listening to those words, that it essentially means that you are unable to move forward with your original agreement because of an act of God. It's beyond your control and making it impossible for you to be able to perform as you had promised. So in that case, you would invoke that doctrine, and you have to prove up that you did take all different kinds of steps to overcome the obstacle that's preventing you from performance, and that despite your best effort, you're still unable to perform. So this is not subjective impossibility, because there's subjective impossibility where I'm not able to perform it, but if you got somebody different, they could still do the job. So it has to be absolute objective impossibility under the circumstances. So let's say my house was flooded out in the middle of a remodeling project, and the painter is not able to finish painting the house because the house is no longer there. It's been destroyed. Then that painter might be able to excuse his performance by invoking the doctrine of impossibility or frustration of purpose or impracticability, because he's not able to finish painting because the house is no longer there. But you couldn't get any other painter to finish the job either, because the house is just not there. So that's very much objective impossibility, not subjective. So once you've gotten to that step and invoked that, and you've shown that it was an act of God, so it wasn't something that was foreseeable at all at the time that you entered into the contract. In addition to that, the courts will look at whether it was such an event that the non-occurrence of that event was actually a basic assumption at the time that you entered into the contract. So it is a basic assumption that my house would have been there for me to even enter into a painting contract in the first place, right? A remodeling contract, because we both assumed that the house will still be there, and then the painter will be able to come in and paint. So the non-occurrence of a flood or a hurricane that completely wiped out my house, that was something that was not anticipated. It was actually an assumption that we both had at the time that we started the contract. So that's how the courts will look at that. The main things that cause impossibility are usually death of a party that's supposed to perform, or destruction of property, or the thing that's needed to perform under the contract, or a government regulation. Like I explained, the shelter at home regulations would affect a lot of people and not allow them to perform under contracts that they already agreed to, because the government was telling us we needed to stay away. So the other example that I could give you is, let's say I signed a lease for renting a house next to the university, and that's because I anticipated going to school for that school year. But then the university had to shut down because of a pandemic, and they wouldn't allow any students to come to school. Then that means I couldn't go to school. Therefore, I don't need that house that I just rented. And not only can I not go to school, no other student, no other renter could actually perform under that contract, because the whole purpose of renting that house was to be able to go to school. So normally you would have a renter that can still use the space, but if the space is shown to have been rented because of the proximity to the school and for the sole purpose of attending the school, let's say it was a dorm or something like that, then you'll have even more of a stronger argument to be able to invoke that doctrine of impossibility. So that is what I wanted to cover today. Those are some examples, and I hope that has been helpful to you. This is for educational purposes, as always. If you have specific questions, you will have to talk to a lawyer directly so that they can answer your questions and give you a consultation. And you can also reach out to us if you're in Texas. We can help with that. Look out for our next video, and if you want us to cover any topics, please comment below and I'll be sure to look into those topics as well. Thank you so